When my stepmother tapped her wine glass and asked for everyone's attention before the turkey was even carved, I assumed she wanted to say a quick prayer or thank the hosts. Instead, she smiled around the table and said, "I just want to clarify something for our newer guests. This home, and everyone in it tonight, is family. Except, of course, for certain people who married in and never really belonged." She looked directly at my parents as she said it. What she didn't know was that I had spent the past 6 weeks quietly working with a real estate attorney, and that the folded document sitting in my lap was about to end her 20-year claim to a house that was never legally hers to control. My name is Michelle Ortiz. I'm 34 years old, a high school biology teacher, and for 8 years I have watched my father's second wife, Denise, slowly try to erase my mother from every family gathering, every photo, and eventually, from the house my mother helped build with her own hands before the divorce. My parents split when I was 19, not because of betrayal or scandal, but because they simply grew apart after 22 years of marriage. It was one of those rare, mature divorces where both sides stayed civil, where my father, Walter, and my mother, Grace, still showed up to my graduation together, still sat at the same table for my wedding, still spoke on the phone every few months about nothing in particular. My mother never remarried. She poured her energy into her small floral shop instead, the one she built from nothing after the divorce, working 12-hour days to keep it alive. My father remarried 4 years after the split to Denise, a woman who made it clear from the very first family dinner that she considered my mother a threat to be managed rather than a co-parent to be respected. What most people in the family didn't know, including my father for years, was the history behind the house Denise now called hers. Before my parents divorced, my mother had inherited a small sum from her own mother, my grandmother, and used every cent of it, along with years of unpaid labor, to help renovate and expand the modest house my father owned, turning it from a cramped 3-bedroom into the sprawling 5-bedroom home that later became the site of every major family holiday. During the divorce settlement, my parents had agreed, informally and later formalized through a private addendum to their divorce paperwork, that my mother would retain a documented financial interest in the property, a kind of silent equity stake, in recognition of what she'd invested, even though my father kept full ownership and residency of the house itself. It was never meant to threaten anyone. It was simply fairness, quietly written into a drawer full of old paperwork nobody thought to revisit for over a decade. Denise moved into that house 4 years after the divorce and immediately began redecorating, not just the walls, but the family's entire memory of who built it. She replaced photos of my mother in the hallway with staged professional portraits of herself and my father. She started referring to the house as the home Walter and I built together at dinner parties, in front of guests who had no idea my mother had spent 3 years of her life sanding floors and painting walls in that same house. My father, a quiet, conflict-avoidant man his entire life, never corrected her. He told me once, sheepishly, that it was easier to let Denise have her version of things than to argue about the past. I let most of it go for years. I told myself it was petty to fight over whose name got mentioned at holiday dinners. But everything changed 18 months ago when I overheard Denise on the phone with a title company, discussing something called a quitclaim deed adjustment, a term I didn't recognize at the time but couldn't stop thinking about afterward. I later learned, through a cousin who worked in real estate, that a quitclaim deed can be used to remove someone's legal interest in a property, sometimes with nothing more than a signed document filed at the county recorder's office. My mother, trusting and never one to chase down old paperwork, had no idea anything had changed. 6 weeks before this Thanksgiving, I finally pulled the original divorce addendum from my mother's old filing cabinet, the one documenting her financial interest in the house, and brought it to a real estate attorney a friend had recommended. What the attorney found made my hands shake as I read the report. 2 years earlier, Denise had filed a quitclaim deed with my father's signature on it, transferring the property fully into both their names as joint owners, effectively erasing my mother's documented financial interest without her knowledge or consent. My father's signature was there, but when the attorney compared it to other documents from that same year, the pen pressure, spacing, and letter formation didn't match anything else my father had signed around that time. She recommended a formal handwriting analysis before we did anything else. 3 weeks later, that analysis confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The signature on the quitclaim deed was very likely not my father's at all. I sat on that information for days, unsure what to do with it, until Denise made the decision for me at Thanksgiving dinner. The table was set beautifully, the way Denise always insisted it be, place cards in elegant calligraphy marking each guest's seat. 22 people were expected, family from both sides, along with several of Denise's close friends from her book club, people who had known her far longer than they'd known any of us. When my parents arrived together, as they always did for holidays, since maintaining that civility mattered to both of them, I noticed something wrong almost immediately. There were only 20 place settings at the table, not 22. My mother's name card was missing entirely. I found Denise in the kitchen and asked, as calmly as I could manage, where my mother was supposed to sit. Denise didn't even look up from the gravy she was stirring. I assumed Grace would understand this year's a little different. We have some of my closest friends joining, and, honestly, seating can get complicated when there are so many blended dynamics to manage. I'm sure she can pull up a chair near the kitchen if she'd like. My mother, standing quietly in the doorway behind me, had heard every word. She didn't say anything. She just nodded and told me she'd be fine finding a spot wherever there was room, the same quiet grace she has shown for 8 years. I pulled my father into the hallway. Dad, Mom doesn't have a seat at the table. Denise just told me to have her sit near the kitchen like she's some kind of afterthought. My father sighed, rubbing his temple the way he does whenever he's avoiding a confrontation. Michelle, please don't start something today. Denise handles the seating. It's probably just a miscount. It's not a miscount, Dad. Her name card isn't even there. And while we're talking about things Denise handles, did you know she filed a deed on the house 2 years ago, removing Mom's financial interest completely? My father's face went blank with confusion. What deed? I never signed anything like that. That's exactly what I thought, I said quietly. Which is why I had it checked. He stared at me, processing, but before he could respond, Denise's voice rang out from the dining room, calling everyone to the table for the pre-dinner toast. My father, ever avoidant, simply said, "We'll talk about this after dinner," and walked back toward the noise. I felt something settle in my chest, cold and certain. There wasn't going to be an after-dinner conversation quiet enough to fix this. Denise had made sure of that the moment she erased my mother's seat. Everyone gathered around the table, my mother standing awkwardly near the kitchen entrance with a small plate, exactly where Denise had suggested she sit. That's when Denise tapped her wine glass, smiled at the room, and delivered her line about certain people who married in and never really belonged, looking directly at my mother as she said it. A few of her book club friends chuckled, clearly not understanding the weight of what had just been said, or who it was aimed at. My father said nothing. He simply stared at his plate, the same way he'd been avoiding this exact moment for 8 years. I stood up slowly, the folded document from my bag now in my hand. "Before we say grace," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the table, "I think there's something everyone should actually understand about this house, since we're apparently clarifying who belongs here tonight." Denise's smile faltered slightly. "Michelle, this isn't the time." "I think it's exactly the time," I said, "since you just told my mother, in front of 20 guests, that she doesn't belong at a table in a house she helped pay to build." Gasps rippled quietly through Denise's friends, who clearly had no idea about the house's history. I unfolded the document. This is the original addendum from my parents' divorce settlement, confirming my mother's documented financial interest in this property, based on the inheritance and years of renovation work she personally funded before the divorce was finalized. I looked at my father. "And this," I said, pulling out the second page, "is a quitclaim deed filed 2 years ago, removing that interest entirely, supposedly signed by you, Dad. Except a certified handwriting analyst confirmed 3 weeks ago that this signature doesn't match yours." The room went completely silent. My father's face strained of color as he looked at the page in my hand, then up at Denise, whose composed smile had entirely disappeared. "Denise, what is she talking about?" he asked, his voice quiet but sharp in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "Walter, I can explain," Denise started, her voice suddenly higher, faster. "I just handled the paperwork when you were traveling for work that year. I thought it would be easier." "You forged my signature on a property document," my father said, cutting her off, standing up from his chair for the first time all evening. "I didn't forge anything. I just filled it out and had it notarized while you were away. You would have signed it anyway," Denise said, her composure cracking further with every word. "That's exactly the definition of forgery," I said quietly, "and it's also fraud, since it removed my mother's legal financial interest without her knowledge, consent, or signature." My father stood there for a long moment, looking between Denise and my mother, who was still standing quietly near the kitchen doorway, dignified as ever, not saying a single word in her own defense because she never needed to. "Grace," my father said finally, "please, come sit down." At the actual table, my mother walked over, calm and composed, and took the empty seat directly across from Denise, the seat that had clearly been meant for one of Denise's book club friends. Nobody objected. Denise's friends made quiet, awkward exits shortly after dinner service began, clearly uncomfortable with the tension still hanging over the table. My father barely spoke for the rest of the evening, though he made sure, for the first time in 8 years, that my mother's plate was properly served before anyone else's. 5 months have passed since that Thanksgiving. My father filed a formal complaint regarding the forged deed, and after a brief legal review, the property records were corrected, reinstating my mother's original financial interest in the house. Denise moved out 3 months ago, into a rental across town, after my father made it clear the marriage wasn't recoverable once trust had been broken so deliberately. The house itself is being sold this spring, with my mother finally receiving the equity she was always legally owed, money she plans to use to expand her flower shop into the empty unit next door, something she's dreamed about for years, but never had the capital to pursue. My father and I talk more openly now than we have in years, mostly about the 8 years he spent avoiding conflict instead of protecting the people who actually told him the truth. I learned that quiet dignity, the kind my mother carried through every humiliating dinner and every missing place card, eventually outlasts every carefully staged version of the truth someone else tries to build a house around.